The smoke never stopped rising from the Harwick family smokehouse, even when the neighbors hadn't seen livestock on the property for months. It curled upward in thin gray ribbons, twisting into the pale mountain sky, as if something down below refused to let go. This wasn't one of those tall Appalachian ghost stories told around campfires. It was something older, darker, born of hunger, cruelty, and the kind of isolation that strips away what's human inside a person until only survival remains. The year was 1847, and the Blue Ridge Mountains of western Virginia were still wild, still haunted. Morning mists clung to the valleys like shrouds, and travelers whispered of places where no birds sang. Nestled deep in one of those hollows stood the Harwick homestead, a cluster of weathered log buildings surrounded by black pines and barren fields. The air always smelled of wood smoke and iron, of corn mash and blood. Even the soil seemed tired, as if it had soaked up too much suffering to bear anything living. Marcus Harwick had built his fortune on three things: moonshine, isolation, and human bondage. While Virginia's great plantations thrived on cotton and tobacco down in the lowlands, Marcus saw opportunity in the hills, where no taxman rode and no sheriff dared to pry too deeply. His property sprawled across 2,000 acres of steep forest, reachable only by a single narrow trail that even horses feared after dark. In the fall of 1843, Marcus had purchased 6 enslaved souls from a failing plantation near Richmond: Samuel, a skilled carpenter, and his wife Ruth, a cook and seamstress, their children Moses and Sarah, and 2 unrelated men, Joshua and Thomas, seasoned field laborers hardened by years of sun and whip. The bill of sale, found decades later in a courthouse basement, listed them like cattle, names beside numbers, lives reduced to currency. The journey to the mountains took 2 brutal weeks by wagon. Iron chains bit into wrists and ankles. Cold rain turned the dirt roads to rivers of mud. Locals along the route pretended not to see. To them, men like Marcus Harwick were part of the landscape, dangerous, powerful, and best avoided. When the small convoy reached the mountains, snow had already begun to dust the peaks. The newcomers were led to a single-room cabin, barely large enough for a family of 2, its gaps stuffed with rags against the wind. No plantation rows awaited them, only jagged slopes of corn, a hidden distillery carved into a cave behind the main house, and a life ruled by fear. The Harwick family themselves lived like kings of their own private hell. Marcus was a large man with eyes that never softened. His wife Eleanor carried herself like a preacher of punishment, her leather whip always hanging beside the kitchen door. Their sons, David, William, and James, had inherited their parents' cruelty. David, the eldest, made torment into a sport. William followed every order without question, and James watched, learning silently his cruelty yet to ripen. The smokehouse stood at the heart of their domain, a squat, windowless building of oak and fieldstone, 20 feet wide and 30 long, its chimney built to pull smoke from slow-burning hickory fires. Inside hung the carcasses of deer, bear, and wild boar, and sometimes meat no neighbor could quite identify. People in the nearest settlement, 30 miles away, wondered how the Harwicks survived every winter with such abundance when no one ever saw them hunt or trade. The Cherokee who once roamed these valleys had spoken of the place long before the Harwicks arrived. They called it the Hungry Valley, a cursed hollow where the spirits of the dead wandered restless, and where the earth itself would feed if men would not. Most white settlers dismissed the story as superstition. Marcus Harwick had laughed when he heard it. But the mountain did not laugh back. By the winter of 1846, something had begun to rot beneath the surface of the Harwick property. The enslaved workers, cut off from every road and every hope, endured cruelty that even other plantations would have called excessive. The cold gnawed their skin. Food was rationed to scraps. Punishments came for glances, for words, for nothing at all. Samuel, once a quiet man, began to change. He studied his captors the way a carpenter studies rotten wood, searching for cracks. He counted the keys on Eleanor's ring, memorized when the dogs were fed, learned the rhythm of footsteps from the main house to the smokehouse. Every creak, every lock, Every careless habit carved itself into his mind like blueprints for something yet to come. The Harwicks had grown comfortable in their cruelty. Their isolation had made them careless. They believed the mountain protected them. But mountains do not protect. They remember. The smoke from the chimney kept rising, day after day, through snow and rain and wind. It carried the scent of salted flesh across the hollow, a constant reminder that the Harwick family's world ran on burning wood and burning souls. The neighbors down the ridge stopped asking questions. They had long learned that in these hills, smoke could mean survival or sin. And so it went on, season after season. The Harwicks drank their own liquor and counted their profits. The enslaved dreamed of freedom but woke to frost and chains, and through it all the smoke never slept. But in the dead heart of that mountain, winter when even the streams had frozen into glass, Samuel began to whisper. He whispered of doors and windows, of keys and maps, of nights when the dogs would be too cold to bark. He whispered of the smokehouse, how it stood apart from the house, how it was full of blades and hooks. He whispered of justice, and the mountain, listening as it always had, seemed to whisper back. February 1847. The Blue Ridge Mountains were locked in the kind of winter that broke bones and hope alike. The air itself felt sharpened to a knife's edge. Trees groaned under the weight of ice and the creeks froze mid-whisper. Even the birds had gone silent. The Harwick homestead sat buried under snowdrifts like a grave marker in a field of white. The only thing that moved, the only sign that life still clung to that hollow, was the thread of smoke rising from the old stone chimney of the smokehouse. Steady, relentless, unending. Inside the main house, the kitchen smelled of whale oil and boiled coffee. Marcus Harwick sat at the table, the light from 2 lamps flickering across his face. He wasn't a man who frightened easily, but that night, something behind his eyes looked uneasy, a crack in the iron. Before him lay a small collection of objects that had turned his blood to frost, a hand-drawn map, lines scratched into scrap parchment, a compass stolen from his son William's nightstand, pouch of dried meat and a makeshift flask of water, and most damning of all, a wooden carving of the mountain ridges, etched by hand, the careful work of a carpenter who had memorized every tree, every bend in the trail, every possible escape. Marcus turned each item over slowly, as though by touching them he could erase what they meant. The silence was heavy enough to suffocate. Behind him the kitchen door creaked open, and Eleanor Harwick stepped in, her face pale and hard as mountain quartz. She carried her butcher knife in one hand, its blade glinting under the lamplight. "Found it where?" she asked. "In the quarters," Marcus replied. "Loose board near the hearth." Eleanor's thin lips pressed into a line. "Samuel," she said his name like a curse. Marcus didn't answer. He didn't need to. The carpenter had always been too clever by half. A man who watched more than he spoke, who repaired doors and fences with the patience of someone waiting for something larger to mend. Eleanor set down her knife on the sharpening stone beside the hearth and began to draw it back and forth in slow, deliberate strokes. The sound was soft but sinister, metal singing over stone, a rhythm that filled the silence between their breaths. "You should have dealt with him the first year," she said flatly. "I told you, Marcus, soft hearts breed rebellion. You feed a dog too well and he thinks he's a man." Marcus looked up at her. His voice was tired, not gentle. "We needed his hands. The distillery would have collapsed without him." "Then it collapses," Eleanor snapped. "Better that than letting one of them start believing he's worth something." From the next room came footsteps. Their eldest son. David, tall, thick-shouldered, a reflection of his father's cruelty sharpened by youth. He glanced at the table and smirked. "Well," he said, "looks like the carpenter's been building more than shelves." He turned the compass over, letting it catch the lamplight, and whistled softly. "That's my compass." I wondered where it went. Eleanor's eyes flicked toward him. "We end this tonight?" Marcus's jaw tightened. "We'll make an example," he said, echoing her. "Once they see what happens to leaders, the rest will remember their place." Outside, the wind moaned through the valley like a dying thing. The mountain didn't care who ruled it. It simply remembered. While the Harwicks plotted, their 6 captives sat huddled in the cold dark of their cabin. The walls leaked wind. their breath hung white in the air. A single candle guttered between them. Samuel sat near the door, head bowed, fingers tracing invisible shapes on the dirt floor. The same pattern he'd drawn in his mind 100 times before. The trail north through Hungry Valley. The narrow pass to the ridge, the river beyond. Ruth watched him quietly, her hands trembling not from fear but from the cold. She knew what those movements meant. She'd seen that same faraway look in her husband's eyes for weeks, the look of a man building something invisible. Joshua spoke first. He found it, didn't he? Samuel didn't answer. He didn't have to. The silence said everything, then we're dead, Thomas muttered. No, Samuel said finally. We're not. Not yet. He looked up, his eyes burning like embers under the candlelight. They think they know what's coming. But so do we. The others exchanged glances. In the far corner, Moses and Sarah stirred under the tattered blankets. The boy's voice was small. Pa, are they gonna hurt us? Samuel's voice softened, though his jaw was iron. Not if we move first. Outside, the dogs barked, restless in the wind. But even the dogs would fall silent before dawn. Back in the main house, David was busy preparing what he called the lesson. He brought a length of hemp rope, coarse and strong, coiled over his arm like a serpent. He had learned the knots from their grandfather, a Kentucky man who'd boasted of hanging thieves and runaways in his youth. James and William fetched lanterns, oil, and heavy coats. They worked without speaking. The plan was simple. Drag Samuel from his bed, march him to the smokehouse, tie him high in the rafters, and leave him there until the thaw. Eleanor insisted she would oversee it herself. If you want obedience, she said coldly, you make them watch. You let them smell it in the smoke. Marcus hesitated. He didn't relish the act, not from mercy, but from the inconvenience of it. Deaths caused mess, and mess drew questions. But Eleanor's mind was made of granite. It ends tonight, she repeated. By 11:30 p.m., the family gathered their tools, rope, knives, and torches. Outside, the snow had stopped falling. The moon glowed pale through the mist, turning the frozen valley silver. The smokehouse chimney still whispered into the sky, a black finger pointing toward heaven. But Samuel was not asleep. For weeks, he had noticed things the Harwicks hadn't. How the hinges on the smokehouse door screamed when cold, but stayed quiet if oiled. How Eleanor always came to check the fires at midnight, alone. How the dogs, when the temperature dropped below zero, were brought inside. The mountain had been teaching him, and he had been listening. Ruth, sitting near the dying embers of the cabin hearth, whispered, "It's tonight, isn't it?" Samuel nodded. "If not tonight, we never get another chance." She closed her eyes, gripping his hand. "Then let the mountain help you." He smiled faintly, not with joy, but with the grim acceptance of a man who had crossed the point of no return. The mountain's already listening. Midnight came like the turning of a blade. In the Harwick house, Eleanor pulled on her black cloak and stepped outside, torch in hand, her breath curling white in the freezing air. Behind her, Marcus stirred in his chair, half asleep, thinking only of the fire that needed tending. Behind a shuttered window, Samuel watched her go, his silhouette blending with the dark. He waited until she disappeared into the night, following the narrow path that led to the smokehouse. Then he rose. The others followed, silent as snowfall. They had no guns, no armor, and only blades meant for cutting meat and ropes meant for hanging it. But sometimes the tools of oppression become the tools of justice. In the valley, the smoke twisted thicker now, fed by new logs and a growing hunger. The wind carried the scent of hickory and something else. Anticipation. Samuel's eyes caught the faint torchlight ahead as Eleanor reached for the door. He exhaled slowly, every sense sharpened by the cold. The moment had come. The dogs, once their greatest alarm, lay sleeping by the fire inside. The family thought themselves safe. They had forgotten that silence can be a weapon. And in that silence, in that breath between heartbeats, the story that would haunt Hungry Valley for a century began to unfold. The dogs stopped barking at 11:43 p.m. That was the first sign. In a place as remote as the Harwick homestead, silence was never comforting. It was a warning. Wind moved through the frozen trees like a whispering choir, and the moon hung pale and watchful above the valley. The Hungry Valley lived up to its name that night. It was waiting to be fed, Inside the enslaved quarters, 6 figures sat in the dark. The fire had died down to faint red coals, but their eyes still glowed with something hotter. Samuel sat nearest the wall, his breath steady, hands flexing against the cold wood. He had oiled the window latch days ago. Now it moved soundlessly beneath his touch. Ruth knelt beside him, clutching his wrist. "It has to be fast," she whispered. "They'll come soon." "They already have," Samuel said quietly. He tilted his head toward the main house, where torchlight flickered behind the frosted windows. Tonight decides everything. In the big house, the Harwicks were preparing their lesson. Marcus stood by the hearth, loading his pistol, while Eleanor tightened her cloak. David coiled the rope in his hands with the patience of a man who had done this before. When cruelty becomes routine, even murder feels like maintenance. "Make it quick," Marcus muttered. Eleanor's eyes were shards of flint. "No," she said. "Make it memorable," David grinned. "They'll remember," he said. All of them. They thought they were hunting men. They didn't realize the mountain had changed the rules. Outside, Samuel's boots broke through a crust of ice as he crossed the yard. The cold bit through his clothes, but he barely felt it. The moon cast long blue shadows across the snow, and the smokehouse loomed ahead like a waiting mouth. Inside, the air was heavy with the smell of hickory and salt. Metal hooks gleamed faintly in the darkness. He knew every inch of the room, where the knives hung, where the floorboards creaked, where a man could disappear into shadow. He crouched behind the central beam, watching the door. Moments later, Eleanor Harwick appeared. The torchlight flickered orange across her face, deepening the lines that years of rage had carved there. She moved with a kind of grim confidence, the authority of someone who believed the world existed to obey her. She pushed open the smokehouse door. The hinges groaned softly, like something alive. The torch's glow spilled over slabs of meat hanging from hooks, their pale shapes swaying slightly in the draft. She stepped inside, muttering to herself about coals and temperature. The door shut behind her, and then everything changed. Samuel moved like a shadow splitting from another. His hands closed around her throat before she could scream. The torch clattered to the ground, the flame sputtering against damp earth. In the dim red light of the coals, Eleanor's eyes went wide with disbelief. Her fingers clawed at his wrists, nails cutting into skin, but Samuel's grip was the grip of 4 years of pain made flesh. The sound she made wasn't human. It was the gasping rasp of power collapsing. Her feet kicked once, twice, then stilled. But death didn't come yet, not until they had all arrived. Joshua and Thomas slipped inside next, silent and grim, carrying the ropes, cleavers, and the will of every life that had ever been crushed under this roof. Even young Moses, barely 12, stood watch at the door, his eyes burning with something no child should ever know. Ruth waited outside with Sarah, her face pale in the moonlight. She didn't need to see. She had already seen too much. Inside, Eleanor's breath came in shallow gasps. Samuel loosened his grip just enough for her to see, to understand. "You used to say desperate animals gnaw off their own limbs to escape," he whispered. "Now you'll see what desperation becomes when it learns to fight back." Thomas picked up the fallen torch and relit it against the coals. The small flame flared, illuminating the tools on the table. Blades, hooks, saws. The same instruments Eleanor had used on their livestock, and sometimes on them. Now they belonged to someone else. Joshua began to bind her hands. Eleanor thrashed weakly, her eyes wide, but Samuel's hand pressed her back down. No one spoke. The only sounds were the hiss of the fire and the crack of frozen air seeping through the gaps in the logs. The mountain seemed to hold its breath. Outside, snow fell in slow, soundless flakes, coating the path between the quarters and the main house. The wind died. The night froze in place, and then came the first muffled scream. Short, sharp, swallowed almost instantly by the valley. The mountain listened. It had heard such cries before, from the hunted, the enslaved, the beaten. But tonight the echo was different. It sounded like balance being restored. Inside the smokehouse, Samuel worked with terrible precision. He wasn't a murderer, not yet. He was a man carving justice out of flesh. Eleanor's struggles grew weaker until they stopped altogether. The torchlight flickered, throwing their shadows across the walls, long and warped, like specters watching from another age. When it was done, Samuel knelt beside the dying fire and whispered something no one else heard. It was a prayer not to God, but to the earth itself, to the valley that had kept their secrets, to the spirits the Cherokee said still lingered here. "Let this feed what's hungry," he said. Joshua and Thomas moved in silence, their faces unreadable. They cleaned the tools, hung fresh wood above the fire, and closed the smokehouse door. The chimney began to smoke again, steady as always, carrying a scent that would drift across the hollow and make every creature pause. The dogs never barked again. Back in the main house, Marcus stirred from sleep. For a brief, disoriented moment, he thought he heard wind howling, or maybe something else. Then silence. He sat up, frowning. "Eleanor?" he called softly. No answer. Only the sound of the fire popping in the hearth. He glanced toward the window. The smokehouse chimney was still exhaling its familiar stream of gray. Comforted by that sight, he lay back down. He didn't know that the smoke carried not warmth, but a warning. In the valley below, justice had found its first breath, and it smelled of hickory, iron, and blood. Warning came slow and gray over the blue ridge. The sun rose like a wounded thing behind clouds, its light too pale to chase away the cold. Frost glistened on every branch, every roof beam, every step that led to the Harwick smokehouse. The smoke still rose from its chimney, steady, perfect, a sign that work had continued through the night. But inside the main house, something was wrong. Marcus Harwick woke to silence. No humming from the kitchen, no clatter of pots, no sound of Eleanor's boots on the stone floor. For 20 years, his mornings had begun with her voice, sharp, efficient, always in motion. This silence felt unnatural. He pulled on his coat, shivering despite the fire still burning low in the hearth. His sons were already stirring. "Pa," David called from the hallway. "Where's Ma?" Marcus frowned. "Probably tending the fires. You know he stopped mid-sentence. The words felt hollow. Eleanor never left without her keys, never left the kitchen in disarray. The table still held last night's dishes, cold coffee pooled in the bottom of her cup. A thin trail of ash led from the hearth to the door, as if something or someone had been dragged. "Check the quarters," Marcus ordered. "If one of those bastards ran off, she'll want them before breakfast." David and William pulled on coats and stepped outside. Their boots crunched through snow. The air was brittle with cold, the kind that split wood and numbed thought. The smokehouse stood 50 yards away, framed against the slope like a tombstone. Smoke curled from its chimney in perfect rhythm, just as Eleanor had always kept it. David hesitated. "Fire's too steady," he said quietly. "If she started it before dawn, it shouldn't be burning this clean." William shrugged, trying to sound braver than he felt. "Maybe she got up early." But the moment they opened the door to the enslaved quarters, the lie began to unravel. The cabin was empty. 6 bunks, cold ashes in the hearth, no footprints leading out. No signs of struggle, just absence. Absolute and impossible. David felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. "They're gone." "Gone?" William scoffed. "Where the hell would they go?" "The pass is snowed in." David didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on something near the door. A single wet footprint melting into the frozen floorboards. It wasn't large. "Looked like a woman's. Get Pa," David said. "Now." Marcus arrived minutes later, breathing hard, shotgun in hand. He scanned the quarters, the walls, the dirt floor, the bunks. Everything was too still. "Too clean. Search the outbuildings," he ordered. Every damn one. They started with the barn, empty. The storehouse, untouched. Finally, they reached the smokehouse. The door stood slightly ajar, swinging gently in the wind. Marcus frowned. Eleanor never left it open. "Stay behind me," he said. He pushed the door slowly, the hinges creaking with a sound that set his teeth on edge. The heat hit him first, a heavy, oily warmth. Then the smell, wood smoke, salt, and something else. Something sweet. Inside, everything looked normal. Too normal. The fire pit glowed steady with coals. Racks of meat hung from the rafters in neat rows. Knives gleamed on their hooks, clean and arranged just as Eleanor kept them. The stones were scrubbed spotless. Marcus stepped forward, his boots echoing softly. "Eleanor?" he called. No answer. Only the hiss of fat dripping onto the coals. He looked up at the meat hanging from the rafters. The cuts were wrong. The grain of the flesh too fine. The color too dark. He had butchered game all his life. He knew venison, boar, beef. This was none of them. David entered behind him, eyes scanning the hooks. "We didn't have this much meat yesterday," he said. "Where'd it come from?" Marcus's breath caught. He turned to the cutting table, Eleanor's table. It was clean, almost polished, but a faint stain darkened the wood near the edge. A bucket sat beneath it, filled with water the color of rust. "Maybe she—" William began, but his voice died as his eyes found the butcher's knife. It lay across the table, blade darker than steel should ever be. David leaned closer to the hanging meat. "This ain't deer," he whispered. "Look at the marbling. The fat line here, that's—" He stopped, unable to finish the thought. "Don't," Marcus said sharply, though his voice trembled. "You don't know what you're looking at." But he did. They all did. They searched for Eleanor for hours, circling the property until the snow filled their footprints. There were no tracks leading out. No torn clothing. No sign of her anywhere. By noon they gathered again in the kitchen, faces pale, eyes hollow. "Maybe she slipped, hit her head," James suggested weakly. "Fell into the creek." David slammed his fist on the table. "She's gone, damn it. And so are the slaves. They did something to her, I know it." Marcus rubbed his temples. "Then where are they, David? Where's her body? Why leave the fires burning, the house untouched?" William leaned back, staring at the window. Maybe they didn't leave. That sentence hung in the air like smoke. At sunset, the smell from the smokehouse changed. It grew stronger, thicker, drifting through the trees into the house itself. The men tried to eat dinner, but every bite turned to ash in their mouths. Still, the fires burned, and none of them dared open the smokehouse door again. That night, as the brothers sat in the parlor, James spoke first. "What if she's in there?" He whispered. David shot him a glare. "You shut your mouth." But Marcus didn't scold him. He just stared into the fire. His mind replayed the sight of those perfect cuts hanging from the rafters, the familiar kitchen tools gleaming where they shouldn't be. Finally, he said, "Tomorrow we'll take inventory. Every tool, every knife, every piece of meat. We'll know what we're dealing with." Morning came again, bringing no warmth. The family gathered in the smokehouse, notebooks in hand, the air stinging with the scent of burning salt. Marcus began marking quantities, his pencil shaking. 4 racks venison, 3 boar. No, that's something else, he stopped. One of the hooks near the chimney carried a strip of flesh with a distinctive scar. A long, thin line that ran down the side like a healed burn. Eleanor had one just like it, from the year she spilled hot tallow on herself while curing meat. Marcus dropped the notebook. His hand went numb. The world tilted. David stared in disbelief. "No," he whispered. That can't be." The wind outside moaned through the cracks in the wall. The smoke curled lazily toward the ceiling, as if the chimney itself were exhaling a secret. They didn't notice the figures watching from the tree line. 6 of them, silent still, their faces hidden in shadow. Samuel's voice drifted faintly on the wind, no louder than the rustle of branches. "You said the smoke would feed you through the winter. Now it will." That evening, the Harwick men sat at the table, bowls steaming before them. No one spoke. The stew smelled richer than usual. James took a bite, frowning. "The meat tastes different," he murmured. "Better." Marcus said nothing. He just stared at his spoon, his stomach turning. Somewhere outside, the smokehouse door creaked shut. The valley had found its rhythm again. Fire, flesh, silence. And by the time night fell, the smokehouse had truly awakened. By the 3rd morning, the Harwick men had stopped pretending life was normal. The smokehouse still burned, its chimney whispering gray clouds into the mountain sky, and the air around the homestead had taken on that unmistakable weight, the weight of something waiting to happen. The animals refused to feed. The horses pulled against their ropes. Even the crows, those tireless scavengers, had abandoned the trees that ringed the valley. Inside, Marcus Harwick sat slumped at the head of the table. The lines in his face cut deeper than age alone could carve. His coffee went cold untouched. His hands, rough and cracked, trembled slightly as he stared into the black liquid. David, the eldest, leaned against the window frame, rifle in hand, watching the path to the smokehouse. William and James lingered by the fire, whispering the same question over and over. "Where's Mother?" The question had no answer, yet none of them could stop asking it. The kitchen looked the same as it always had, and that was what made it so wrong. The table was set, Food steaming. Eleanor's cornbread, fried potatoes, a pot of stew. Everything arranged exactly as she had done it for 20 years. But the doors had been locked from the inside all night. No one had entered the kitchen. When Marcus finally forced himself to taste the stew, the flavor was unmistakable. Richer, deeper, almost sweet. He lowered his spoon slowly, heart pounding. Who cooked this? No one answered. The day passed under a sky the color of lead. The wind carried the scent of smoke and something else beneath it. Something faintly sweet, metallic, wrong. By dusk, the smokehouse's shadow stretched long across the snow, and Marcus could bear the uncertainty no longer. We end this tonight, he said, voice hard. If there's evil in that house, we root it out. David nodded grimly and loaded his rifle. William fetched a lantern. James hesitated but followed. They crossed the yard together, boots crunching in rhythm, the sound echoing through the hollow like slow drums. The smokehouse door loomed ahead, wood blackened by years of fire and salt. The hinges creaked when Marcus pushed it open. Heat washed over them, thick and greasy. The fire still burned strong, feeding on carefully stacked wood. And the racks. We're full. Impossible, William whispered. We didn't hunt. We haven't hunted in weeks. Marcus's gaze traced the hooks. The cuts were arranged perfectly, each piece labeled with a small scrap of paper in Eleanor's tidy script. But the handwriting, it was wrong. It looked imitated, a mockery of her careful hand. David took a step closer to the cutting table. The butcher's knife lay there again, gleaming in the firelight. Beneath it sat something he hadn't noticed before. A small sewing kit. Eleanor's, the one she kept by the kitchen window. A single needle was missing. The hair on the back of his neck rose. Someone's been in here, he whispered. The wind outside shifted, pressing against the door. For a heartbeat, the smoke twisted into shapes that looked almost human. Faces flickering in the heat. Gone as soon as they appeared, Pa, James murmured. I think she's... Don't say it, Marcus growled, but his voice broke halfway through. Don't you dare say it. They returned to the house in silence. That night, Marcus dreamt of fire. He dreamt of Eleanor's eyes staring through the smoke, not with malice but with recognition, as if she were seeing him from somewhere deeper than death. He woke drenched in sweat to the smell of roasting meat and the sound of footsteps downstairs. He grabbed his shotgun and crept to the kitchen door. The lamp still burned. Someone was moving at the table, David, he called softly, no answer. Only the scrape of a chair, the faint rhythm of a knife on wood. He stepped into the room and froze. 6 figures stood around the table, their faces half lit by the oil lamp. Samuel, Ruth, Joshua, Thomas, Moses, and Sarah. They looked alive and calm, their clothes clean, their eyes clear. In Samuel's hand gleamed Eleanor's butcher knife, its blade spotless as though it had just been washed. Good evening, Mr. Harwick, Samuel said evenly. His tone was polite, almost civil. We thought it best to prepare breakfast early. You've had a long few days. Marcus's throat went dry. Where's my wife? Samuel's expression didn't change. Your wife is here, he said quietly. Closer than you think. Ruth stepped forward, setting down a tray of sliced smoked meat. The scent was intoxicating. Savory, rich, seasoned to perfection. She taught us everything, Ruth added softly. Every cut, every measure of salt, every recipe. She was a fine teacher. Marcus stumbled backward, the words clawing at his mind. No, that's not... Samuel raised the knife slightly, letting it catch the light. Do you know what justice smells like, Mr. Harwick? Smells like smoke. It smells like what you fed us for 4 years. The flavor of fear, slow cured over fire until it tastes like mercy. David burst through the door behind him, rifle raised. You touch my father out, but he didn't finish. Joshua and Thomas moved like shadows. In seconds, the rifle was gone. The butt slammed against David's jaw, sending him sprawling. Sit, Samuel ordered, his tone calm but final. You've taken enough from us. Tonight we return the favor. The fire in the hearth roared louder. The air shimmered with heat. Ruth poured whiskey into cups and slid one toward Marcus. Drink, she said. You'll need the courage. Marcus stared at the smoke curling from the cup's rim. His heart pounded, but something inside him broke. The last brittle remnant of control. Why? He croaked. You could have run. You could have gone north. Samuel's eyes darkened. And leave our ghosts behind? Leave your crimes unburied? He gestured toward the smokehouse outside the window. "That place is our church now, Mr. Harwick. Our altar. Every plank in its walls was built from our suffering. And tonight it'll be your confessional." The others began to hum, low, rhythmic, like a funeral chant. The sound filled the kitchen thick as fog. Marcus turned to flee, but Ruth was already there, holding the knife Eleanor used for bread. Her voice was almost tender. "Don't run," she said. "It's cold outside." Later, the snow began to fall again, heavy and silent. From the valley below, a faint orange glow pulsed against the night. The smokehouse fires burning hotter than ever. The wind carried the scent down into the hollow, mingling hickory, salt, and something that made every animal for miles retreat into its den. By morning, the smokehouse door was closed, its latch freshly oiled. The chimney exhaled a steady stream of gray, smooth as before. Inside, on the central table, sat 3 plates. Each one bore a simple carving burned into the wood. Marcus, David, William. The 4th plate was left empty. The name beneath it had been scratched away, as if the mountain itself had chosen to forget. Outside, Samuel stood beneath the dawn sky, watching the smoke rise, his breath merging with it. Behind him, Ruth and the others began packing supplies. Tools, salt, and wrapped parcels of cured meat. They would survive the winter. They always would. And as Samuel looked toward the mountains, he whispered the words the Cherokee had once spoken about this place. The hungry valley feeds itself. By the time the sun rose over the ridges, James Harwick was the only one left alive in the main house, or at least the only one who could still call himself living. The first light of dawn fell weak and colorless across the frost-glazed windows, illuminating a kitchen that looked eerily perfect. The table was still set for breakfast, plates neatly stacked, cups arranged, just so. Only the empty chair at the head of the table, his father's chair, spoiled the illusion. The smell of smoke drifted in through the cracks, thicker now, sweeter, impossible to ignore. James sat motionless in the corner, clutching his rifle. His hands shook violently, his breath shallow. He hadn't slept. Every creak of the floorboards, every sigh of wind through the chimney made him flinch. He could still hear their voices, David shouting, his father pleading, the wet sound that followed. The fire had drowned most of it, but not enough. Never enough? He had tried to go to the smokehouse once before dawn. He had made it halfway across the yard before the smell hit him. It wasn't meat anymore. It was memory. It was family. He had turned back before reaching the door. Now, with the morning light creeping across the floor, he understood the truth that Marcus had refused to see. The mountain wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by the living. By mid-morning, the valley had gone silent again. The birds that sometimes gathered on the tree line were gone. The wind itself seemed to avoid the Harwick property. James forced himself to move. His body felt hollow, his mind frayed. The others were gone, taken, burned, or butchered, he couldn't tell which. All he knew was that the smokehouse never stopped. It ate and breathed like something alive. He loaded his rifle with trembling fingers and stepped outside. The snow crunched softly under his boots. His breath came out in ragged clouds. The smell hit him stronger now, clinging to everything. The walls, the ground, even his clothes. It wasn't just wood smoke anymore. It was something heavier, almost oily. When he reached the smokehouse, the door was closed. No sound came from within. The chimney still exhaled thin gray ribbons. Steady and patient like a heartbeat, James hesitated, then pushed the door open. Inside, the warmth enveloped him immediately, almost comforting until his eyes adjusted. The fire pit glowed softly. The racks were full again. Meat glistening, cured, perfectly arranged. Hooks swayed gently in the draft. And there, in the center of the room, sat Samuel, calm as a priest before an altar. He was sharpening Eleanor's knife on a whetstone, slow, methodical, deliberate. Behind him, Ruth was stacking wooden crates. Joshua and Thomas stood in the shadows, silent, watchful. "Come in, James," Samuel said without turning. "You shouldn't stand in the cold." "It's rude to let the door hang open." James froze. Where are they?" Samuel smiled faintly, still facing the fire. "Which they?" he asked. "Your father? Your brothers? Or the ones you used to call animals?" James's voice cracked. "You killed them." Samuel looked up at last, his eyes dark and steady. "No, James, we fed them. To the only thing in these mountains that ever gave them peace. He stood, wiping the blade clean on a rag. Your family believed the mountain belonged to them. But it never did. It belonged to those who listened, to those who remembered the old stories. He gestured to the fire. The Cherokee called this valley Asevskanugi, the hungry place. It takes what it's owed. James backed toward the door. You're monsters. Samuel's smile widened, but it wasn't cruel. It was almost sorrowful. No, we were made into this. You turned us into what we had to become. Joshua moved closer, blocking the exit. Ruth placed a hand on James's shoulder. Not roughly, almost gently, like a mother calming a child. Sit, she said softly. Eat? I'm not, but then he saw it. A bowl on the table, steam rising from it. The scent was familiar, too familiar. It was his mother's stew. His stomach lurched. Ruth's hand tightened. It's what she would have wanted, she whispered. She fed you all your life. Now she'll feed you one last time. James shoved her away, stumbling backward. The rifle came up in shaking hands. Stay back. Samuel sighed. You still don't understand. You think this is punishment? It isn't. This is balance. He took a step forward. You kill because you can. We kill because we must. The difference between us, James, is that you did it for profit. We do it to live. James fired. The shot cracked through the smokehouse, deafening. Samuel didn't fall. He simply stood there, looking down at the hole in his coat, where the bullet had flattened against something beneath, an old iron key that hung from a leather cord around his neck. The smokehouse groaned, the sound deep and low, like the mountain itself answering the shot. The coals flared, sparks danced in the air, and suddenly the heat doubled. Now you've angered it, Samuel said quietly. The mountain's awake again. He stepped aside, and for the first time James saw the far wall. It wasn't a wall at all anymore. The wood had warped, blackened, and cracked open into a jagged hole that led downward, into the earth. Heat and smoke poured from it, pulsing in rhythm with the fire. What is that? James whispered. Samuel's eyes reflected the flames. That's where your family's debts go to rest. The floor shuddered. Chains hanging from the rafters rattled. Hooks swung wildly, clanging against each other. James stumbled backward as the fire roared higher, swallowing the light. The smell of salt, ash, and blood filled the air. Get away from me, he screamed. Samuel didn't move. Ruth and Joshua only watched. The smoke thickened, curling around James like hands. He tried to run, but the door slammed shut on its own, the latch locking with a metallic click. Through the haze, faces seemed to form. Eleanor, Marcus, David, William. Their mouths open, not screaming, but singing. James dropped his rifle, clawing at the door. Please, please, let me out. Samuel's voice was almost tender. You always said we were animals, James, but you were wrong. Animals kill to eat. Only humans kill to own. He turned toward the fire. The valley forgives neither. The coals exploded into light. The room filled with a shriek that wasn't sound but vibration, a sound that rattled the ribs. When the smoke cleared, James Harwick was gone. Only the fire remained, burning steady as ever. Hours later, Samuel stood outside, looking at the rising smoke. Ruth came to stand beside him, her face pale but calm. It's finished, she said. He nodded. No, he said softly. It's begun. From the distance came the faint tolling of a bell, the chapel bell from the settlement a day's ride away. Maybe they'd seen the smoke. Maybe they'd come to ask questions. Samuel turned to Ruth. We'll leave before nightfall. Pack what we can carry. The rest belongs to the valley. As they walked away, the smokehouse door creaked open one last time, though no wind stirred. Inside, the fire burned low, embers glowing red like eyes beneath ash. From the coals came a sound faint and slow, almost like breathing. And then the whisper, low, ancient, endless. The valley is fed. The Harwick homestead did not die when its owners did. It changed shape, as if the mountain itself had decided to keep breathing through new lungs. The fires in the smokehouse burned all that winter, steady and disciplined. By March, the snow around it had melted in a perfect circle, an island of thaw in a sea of white. The air above shimmered faintly, as though the heat came not from wood but from something older. Samuel stood outside one morning, sleeves rolled, face pale with exhaustion. His breath mingled with the last of the smoke rising from the chimney. He had not slept more than an hour a night since the final Harwick fell, but his body no longer seemed to care. He had work to do. Behind him, Ruth was stirring mash in the copper stills. Joshua stacked firewood. Thomas and young Moses carried sacks of salt into the cellar. Sarah only ate, traced patterns in the frost on the window, humming a tune that wasn't quite Christian, wasn't quite human. The rhythm came from somewhere deeper, the rhythm of the valley itself. Keep the fires even, Samuel said. If they drop too low, the meat spoils. If they rise too high, the smoke gets bitter. Ruth nodded without looking up. Same as before, she murmured. Just different hands now. By early spring, word had reached the settlements that the Harwicks had gone east. No one questioned it too closely. The family had always been private, and their distillery had always produced good liquor. When traders arrived that May, they found the property cleaner, more orderly, better run than they'd ever seen. A tall man named Samuel Hardin, as he called himself now, met them at the gate. His tone was measured, his eyes calm. The Harwicks have moved to Richmond for the season, he told them easily. They left me to manage the business. You'll find our whiskey improved. It was true. The barrels stacked in the smokehouse were smoother, stronger, more consistent than anything the Harwicks had ever made. The traders left with heavy wagons and easy consciences, and Samuel counted gold he had never thought he would touch. Each night, he lit a single lantern and sat by the smokehouse, staring at the valley. Sometimes the wind shifted and carried with it the faintest smell of charred iron and salt. The mountain was quiet, but it was not asleep. Ruth began keeping a ledger. She wrote in careful script. February, 6 gone. March, business steady. April, new buyers from Staunton. Product pure. Between the numbers and notes, she sometimes added a line of her own thoughts. The mountain remembers who feeds it. Smoke means survival, but also confession. The others worked like people possessed. The farm prospered. They smoked venison, traded cornmeal, rebuilt fences, repaired roofs. They spoke little of what had happened, not out of fear, but reverence. The Harwicks had been absorbed, and in some quiet, sacred way, the land itself had changed. By midsummer, the first strangers came asking questions. A federal revenue agent named Joseph McKinley rode up from Winchester, his coat dusted with pollen, his face red from the climb. He dismounted near the distillery and removed his hat. Fine place you've got here, he said. Can't say I expected to see it thriving. Samuel greeted him politely, offering water from the well. We've had a good season, sir. Funny, the agent said, glancing around. Locals told me the Harwicks disappeared, yet everything here looks better than before. Samuel smiled faintly. They left it in capable hands. McKinley nodded, jotting notes in his ledger. And the workers? Paid, free, and willing, Samuel said evenly. The agent looked around the yard where Ruth and the children were hanging strips of meat to dry. Their movements were calm, purposeful, free. Something about the scene unsettled him. It looked too orderly, too peaceful. Well, he said finally, if you ever see Marcus or his kin again, tell them their taxes are due come winter. Samuel inclined his head. I'll pass the message. As McKinley rode away, the others waited until his horse disappeared beyond the ridge before they exhaled. Ruth came to Samuel's side. How long before they stop coming? As long as there's smoke, he said. Someone will wonder what burns. That fall, the valley bloomed late. The soil, once poor and rocky, turned black and rich. Corn grew taller. The deer returned to the woods. Even the streams ran clearer. The neighbors called it a miracle. Samuel called it payment. Each evening, the group gathered by the fire and shared food and quiet. They never spoke the Harwick name again. Instead, they called the property the Freedman's Place. Travelers who passed through were offered whiskey and dried meat. None left hungry. But sometimes, when the night wind was right, the smoke would drift low over the trees, and the visitors would swear they heard whispers in it, soft voices reciting names they didn't recognize. Ruth began teaching Sarah and Moses how to read and write. She used the Harwick Bible, its pages smudged with ash. One evening, Moses asked her, "Are we bad people now?" Ruth smiled sadly. Bad people build chains. We broke ours. As winter crept back down the mountains, the snow came late but heavy. The fires in the smokehouse burned without pause. Samuel started noticing things again. Shapes in the mist, flickers of movement beyond the tree line. One night, he followed the sound of crunching snow and found prints near the old family grave plot, bare feet, small. He knelt, touched the frozen ground, and whispered, "You're free now. Rest." The wind stopped for a moment. Then the smoke from the chimney twisted sharply eastward, as though bowing. That night, Samuel dreamed of Eleanor Harwick standing at the edge of the forest. Her dress was burned away to gray ash, her eyes bright and empty. She didn't speak. She just looked at him, then turned toward the smokehouse and vanished. When he awoke, the fires had burned low, but the coals glowed red, steady, alive. By the time spring came again, the valley no longer felt cursed. It felt fed. People who traveled through spoke of it as a strange, fertile place. A hollow where the soil grew things that shouldn't thrive, and the air always smelled faintly of wood smoke. The legend began to spread. They called it the Revenant Winter, the year the mountain came back to life, and through it all the chimney never stopped breathing, as if the hungry valley itself had learned to exhale. By the time spring of 1848 thawed the last veins of ice from the Blue Ridge, the Harwick property had become something entirely different. It no longer belonged to a single man, or even to the 6 who now kept its fires alive. It belonged to the valley itself, a place that remembered what it was owed. The snow melted late that year. When it finally did, it revealed the valley's transformation. Where fields had once lain gray and stunted, the soil was black and alive. Wild herbs grew in impossible clusters near the stream. Trees that had been dead for years now bore pale green buds. Travelers who passed through the mountains told stories of a hollow that felt different, though no one could say why. The locals had given it a name, the Freedman's Place. To those in nearby settlements, it was a curiosity, a farm run entirely by black hands that not only survived the winter of 47, but seemed to flourish while others perished. To those who had lived it, it was something else entirely. Atonement carved from horror. Samuel had learned to keep ledgers like Marcus once did, but his were different. Each page recorded not only production and trade, but also remembrance. March 3rd, sold 3 barrels whiskey, 2 crates meat to Staunton trader. Price fair. No questions asked. April 9th, children learning well. Ruth's new curing method keeps longer. May 12th, wind spoke through chimney again. It sounded like names. The others pretended not to hear it, but Samuel knew. The valley's hunger had not vanished. It had simply changed its appetite. He sometimes caught himself talking to the smokehouse fire as if it were listening. Perhaps it was. That summer brought visitors again, travelers, traders, and wanderers. One of them was a Methodist preacher, Ezekiel Thornton, who kept a small journal of his roots. His entry for June 1848 would later be found in a church archive. Came upon a prosperous farm near Hungry Valley. Negroes working clean and quiet. Smokehouse well kept. Strange peace in the air. Asked after the Harwick family. Told they'd gone to Richmond. The man who spoke to me was called Samuel. Eyes sharp as flint. Couldn't shake the feeling that he was measuring me, weighing what kind of man I was. Thornton had left before nightfall, content to believe what was easy. But the story of that visit, and the strange, steady smoke that rose every evening, would linger. By autumn of 1848, the fires began to fade. Samuel no longer needed to feed them. The last of what the Harwicks had left behind was gone, consumed, transmuted, sanctified in its own terrible way. He gathered the group one night outside the smokehouse. The stars glimmered cold and blue above the ridges. The coals inside glowed faintly as though breathing their final breath. "It's finished," Ruth said softly. Samuel shook his head. "No, it's complete." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded piece of paper, rough, smudged with soot. "I've written something," he said. "A letter. For whoever finds this place next." He set it on the table inside the smokehouse, weighed it down with a small stone. Then he took Eleanor's old key ring, the same one she had worn at her belt, and hung it from a nail above the door. "Let them know what this valley costs," he said. That night the fire burned one final time. In the morning, only ash remained. When the group left, they carried little. A few tools, a Bible, a sack of seed corn, the ledgers, and the letter Samuel had copied for each of them. They walked north by night, following the same paths once mapped in secret under the floorboards of the quarters. They crossed into Pennsylvania before the first frost. From there, the records blur. Some say they reached Ohio, others Michigan. But the mountains never forgot their names. 75 years later, Staunton, Virginia, 1923, Martha Delacqua, 94 years old, lay dying in a narrow bed. Her grandson Thomas sat beside her, holding her frail hand as she whispered stories that no one had ever asked her to tell. They weren't monsters, she said. Not the way the stories say. She coughed, the sound brittle as dry leaves. They were survivors. They did what they had to do when the world gave them no choice. Thomas frowned. Grandmother, you mean the Hungry Valley people? Her eyes opened wide, two pale blue ghosts beneath thin lids. Samuel, Ruth, the children? They weren't ghosts, child. They were free people doing what free people must. Living, even when it meant eating the past to keep the future alive. She reached under her pillow and drew out a small wooden box. Inside lay a folded letter, its ink faded but still legible, and a child's ribbon, pink, delicate, impossibly preserved. Thomas unfolded the letter and began to read. October 15th, 1848. To whoever finds this place next, we leave this property to those who can make better use of it than we could. The mountain gave us what we needed to survive, but survival is not the same as living. Freedom requires more than the absence of chains. It requires the courage to build new ones from your own choices. The valley is hungry always. Feed it truth, not flesh. Feed it with what you build from the ashes. If you listen closely on winter nights, you will hear the mountain breathe. It does not forget. Neither should you. Thomas looked up, shaken. Is this real? Martha smiled faintly. As real as smoke. You can't hold it, but you can smell it when the wind's right. She closed her eyes. They left this valley alive. The rest of us stayed and turned it into a story so we could live with what we did to them. But the truth was always in the smoke. 50 years later, 1978, archaeologists excavating the old Harwick site unearthed what remained of the smokehouse. Beneath the stone floor, they found a hidden chamber. Inside lay artifacts, a sewing kit, a carpenter's compass, a child's doll carved from hickory, and bones, a human, 4 sets, disarticulated, burned, but carefully arranged in a circle. Tests confirmed they belonged to 4 adult men and women of European descent, dated to the winter of 1847 to 48. The official report ended clinically. Evidence suggests post-mortem processing consistent with 19th century butchering techniques. But among the researchers, whispers spread of strange readings, of heat signatures beneath the ground long after the fires had died, of nights when the air still smelled faintly of hickory and salt. Locals began avoiding the hollow again, except on cold nights, when smoke rose once more from the ruins, drifting through the trees like a memory. Today, the valley is quiet. The trees have reclaimed the fields, but every few winters travelers still report the same thing. A column of gray smoke curling from where no chimney stands, and the faint mouth-watering scent of roasting meat in the air. Some say it's just the wind. Others know better, because hunger never dies. It only learns to wait. And if you ever stand in that hollow beneath the blue shadow of the mountains, and the wind carries that smell to you, you'll understand why the old folks still whisper, the hungry valley feeds itself.